Okay, so this evening's seminar is given by Dr. Anna McGregor from Glasgow University. She's in the School of Biodiversity, One Health and Veterinary Medicine at Glasgow. And originally, Anna worked on marine mammal passive acoustics, and she did an MPhil at St Andrews, looking at social structure in killer whales, which would be interesting, and a PhD at Duke University in America on right whales. Her more recent research focuses on the use of soundscapes to assess marine habitat quality, as well as the subject tonight, which is the environmental variables influencing native oyster distribution. And also she looks into understanding how people's past relationships with well-known but underappreciated organisms like oysters have affected them. And of course, she's very heavily involved in university teaching and developing skills, etc., etc. So I'd like to thank her very much for volunteering for this little talk tonight. And over to you, Anna.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak. And it's Phil said, my background's really in how animals are affected by sound, which actually has led me into oyster beds and how you can measure biodiversity on oyster beds through sound. But through that, I sort of have become quite interested in the history of the decline and sort of figuring out why factors might have led to it. Which has sort of also brought me to understanding the modern industry a little bit. So it's going to be probably quite a few aspects of the history related to native oysters in Scotland on the West Coast. So, right, let's go. Okay, so why oysters are so important? I'm going to start with a little bit of the modern day kind of interest in them. And then I'll switch to the history because I realize this is the history of an interest group. So but there are a lot of different ecosystem services and reasons that they're very important both to the natural environment and to people. And actually, sadly, on this figure, the cultural services are sort of quite a small aspect of this. There's lots of different ways I think you can see how they have provided benefit to people. Like most of the world, actually, oysters are in very, very low numbers. And there have been a lot of sort of, I guess, there's a very nice paper put together by Ruth Thurston and colleagues looking at that across Europe and whether you could use historical data to look at past distributions, which is a really important, I think, piece to understand when you're trying to figure out where they grew well and also where it's most beneficial to kind of restore them. So through that, there's actually some very nice information about the history of oysters in Scotland, in particular this book about the environmental history of the Firth of Forth, which covers all things oysters, shellfish, seabirds. It's a very interesting read if you're interested. But one of the things it highlights is it focuses on the big fisheries, the big industrial fisheries where people extracted them for sale, basically to move and sell over parts of the world. And it does highlight the Piscatorial Atlas was another survey done in 1883, looking at where the large populations are for harvesting. So that survey didn't focus just on oysters, but it was sort of the industries, all the finfish, where basically you could get them and where they were. So it gives us a little bit of information about historical declines at that point in time, or historical presence at that point in time. But what Ruth's paper did, Thurston et al., was sort of expand that more widely, looking at quite a few different types of sources. And that's sort of what I want to go into in more depth for this talk, and specifically focusing on the west coast of Scotland. So hopefully you can see in the figure on the left, so that's across Europe where there were recorded mentions of oysters and even where they were able to extract the size of that historical reef. across lots of locations. So the orange dots are where they were able actually to get an idea of the size of the reef. And then the stars or the sort of black crosses are where there was mentions, but they really couldn't extrapolate. So if you look at Scotland, there's quite a lot of recorded reefs, but no areas really known well. So what I was really interested in is trying to get into that more. Can we find either more locations, but also sort of ideas about why they were used, why they were extracted? Because there's not really evidence of large scale industrial harvesting. So one of the interesting aspects of that, so I'll go into the sources that we use, the historical sources. But actually, when you're looking at sources, I think it's quite important to understand why they were recording that evidence and also the perspectives of who was recording it. One of the other really nice elements of Ruth Thurston's paper was they actually looked at when written records of oyster beds were available. So that's the plot that's on the bottom left. So you can see there's lots of records after about 1800. That's when people started to really, basically it became a commercial industry. So then it became quite recorded in written records. However, that tends to be focused on places where people could write and also sort of socioeconomic groups where there was, exchange of trade. So there's a bit of, I would say, a bias there, but a perspective in terms of the amounts and the records. One thing that's really interesting on the west coast of Scotland is there was a really strong importance related to oral traditions. So basically, people would tell stories. They would pass stories down through generations and songs as well. So this sort of gives a window into a different part of society. People who maybe worked the land, people who were very living in different parts of the coast. And also the really interesting thing about a lot of these oral traditions is they're very, very descriptive in terms of the language, the place names. I'll go into that in a minute, and the songs. So they're actually quite really passionate about their place, and so they conveyed that through these oral traditions or what we call cultural artifacts. Which, if you haven't run across that term, it's sort of the intangible parts of a culture. So not necessarily the things that were left behind, but the pieces of sort of things you can't record. West cultural traditions on the west coast of Scotland have been quite of interest to ethnographers, to storytellers, and to folks who kind of lived in the west coast and did a lot of work recording stories in Gaelic. Were the two folks shown here, John Francis Campbell, who was from Islay, and so he spent a lot of time going around the west coast, going to towns, to people's homes, and recording these stories. Another individual was Margaret Fay Shaw, who lived on Canna for a bit, Canna House, and took a lot of recordings of both the songs and the stories, and written recordings. So we have an idea of what they were from within communities. So I do want to define a little bit what I'm talking about here, because that is one thing. There's a lot of terms that can relate to shellfish and different industries. So I'm going to specify. So I'm not really talking about creel-based fisheries. So for things like crabs, lobsters, langoustines that are kind of caught in pots on the seabed. I'm also not talking about scallops, which often, they live a bit and they sort of biologically move and have a different kind of ecological niche than a lot of the other shellfish. What I really focused on with this was looking for a little bit, well, oysters to start with, but I actually did run across lots of mentions for mussels, but also cockles, limpets, and periwinkles. And so I should say they're slightly different ways they are dealt with in terms of both ownership and also, who harvesting. Cockles, limpets, and periwinkles are freely available on the shore, and they were very much collected and gathered, particularly in times when other food sources weren't available. And there is a lot of, I would say, comment about food preferences, about whether you like the taste of these things or not. And actually, there's lots of interesting, once you get into food cultures and preparation techniques, that's a whole nother another talk. Um, but there are some sort of devices. These are basically sort of tools that were used in the early 1900s to extract cockles in particular from the sand. So cockles, limpets, and periwinkles live a little bit further up on the shore. They're more what we call intertidal shellfish, rather than oysters and mussels, which occur a little bit lower and need more coverage of the water. They also tend to fix onto surfaces rather than cockles, limpets, and periwinkles, which are more loose or in the sediment, in soft sediments. So there's slight differences in kind of the ecology of those groups, which then affect where people could access them and collect them. So these are some of the sources we looked at for the historical mentions of oysters to try to get an idea of where they were historically, and at different points in time. So the earliest kind of historical mention is Martin Martin's Journey to the Western Isles, which is in 1699. So that's actually quite, an early reference and compared to a lot of the commercial harvesting. But we also looked in for collected stories. In Tobra Andulichis is a archive, digital archive run by the School of Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh. And it basically has loads and loads of stories, songs, recordings that you can listen to try to, or to hear about all kinds of ways of life. So basically there were people that went around and audio recorded from people living in communities across Scotland. We also use name books and statistical accounts, which are very much records of what was going on. So name books are basically records of place names from collected in the Ordnance Survey that allow you, and some of those have descriptions of the habitat or the animals present. So that's the sort of columns on the bottom left. And the name books, there's actually, again, an online access, so you could search for terms, you can search for locations related to place names. I'll go into place names in a little bit of in a moment. But another source was actually, again, there was sort of these travel diaries where people would take voyages looking both for the natural history, the geology. One of the well-known ones was Johnston and Boswell. Went to various Hebridean islands and took records of what they encountered there. And the last thing I should say, we did look in government reports a little bit. Most of those were a bit later and focused more on the commercial side. So we didn't really go into those as much as, and certainly a few further directions to go. But on the top, we actually shows a map, an Ordnance Survey map, for a historical one, showing a mention of a place that mentioned oysters in particular. So to study place names, it's a field of research called toponymics. So you look for elements in the words that are associated with a particular place, looking at the different linguistic origins. And you can tell a lot about the connection of people with a particular place through the name people gave that place. Now, there's a lot of studies, not quite as simple as just it's called that, because it can change over time. It can reflect the cultural, the historical landscape of a place. In modern examples, there are some locations that were renamed for one reason or another, reflecting kind of the cultural politics happening at the point in time. So I like this quote there's a good book that goes through place names and how you can use them. So it describes it as a social construct that shows people's attachment to the land they live in, to help the communities to navigate and orientate, pass down oral traditions, and demonstrate changes to the landscape. So one of the challenges too is because we were looking for sort of a marine feature or a coastal feature, the number of the connection is sort of limited, actually, I think, the extent of place names related to it. A lot of place names research, I think, focuses more on landscapes, so mountains, shapes, locations. However, there are actually in coastal areas, consistent mentions of coastal animal species, coastal plant species, seaweeds as well. Another whole area you could go down to, place names around seaweed. Um, and actually, this just to show one of the things we did run across was this fabulous drawing in a manuscript of an oyster from like 1350, which is probably the earliest reference that we found to oysters, and it looks like quite an angry one. But so it does show that people were quite aware, and there's actually a lot of evidence from Roman connections further south in the UK than Scotland. So that's a little bit of a background to place names. But actually, this is sort of one of the really interesting aspects to kind of understanding historical distributions, but then also what people were seeing in the landscape. So um, I should acknowledge my colleagues, Carly McNamara and Alistair White, that put this together. So they looked for place names. And the way the place names work is there's a number of elements to the name. So usually there's the first element that's about the land feature, and then a second element that's sometimes descriptive, so a color, and or a person's name. So you can sort of piece together those kind of the translation, but also the description of the place. So the first one, Aesir, which is basically just the Gaelic word for oyster or oysters. So when they first looked at name books and maps, they basically came up with two mentions that actually had the word oyster, which kind of was a little bit like, this might be a very short project. But actually, they then expanded to looking for habitat. And actually, that's been really, really fruitful. And when you think about it, if we're looking for restoration or trying to study the environment, it's actually the habitat that maybe is quite important to explore, not just, people found oysters there. So the Ochir place name relates to a shoal or a bank of sand, which actually has been quite an interesting one. And I'll go into that, why that is true later. So and then the other one that's actually turned out to be kind of a reliable indicator of oyster presence is a Dorlin place name. So the English translation is an isthmus or a tidal causeway. But actually, there's a little bit more when you start looking at the features repeatedly, where we found the place names, you can see kind of a consistency. And I think it's actually related to the hydrodynamics that caused that coastal area to shape that way. But that also means it's quite a good spot for oyster habitat. We did look up also a few place names related to shelly or shells. The challenge there is, as I introduced at the start, there are lots of types of shells, lots of shellfish. So just because something's called morach or sligach doesn't necessarily mean it's oyster shells there. So those are the Gaelic place names. And one important element to this analysis, and you can actually look at sort of movements of people related to landscape, is also the linguistic origin. So I think there are 6 language backgrounds that the place names come from in Scotland. And they have regional kind of differences. So Gaelic was very much on the West Coast for coastal place names. If you go further north into Lewis Harris, the Western Isles, there are a lot of Norse place names reflecting kind of Viking Norse influences in those areas. The same with, and we haven't looked as much into Orkney and Shetland, but connections there. And there were more Scots ones down in kind of the southwest of Scotland. So I should say, actually, so once we did this analysis, just based on name books, just based on kind of a first pass, and you can go into more detail, you can try to get other maps or other points in history to look for more detailed, basically cartography. So when more place names were recorded on a particular map, or you can go and ask people in the area if they recognize or knew of any places with those names. So we really focused, and again, we were focusing on the West Coast mostly. So from about the Solway Firth up to Skye. We didn't really, we weren't looking at areas where there were a lot of the Norse place name. So actually, I have put little stars on the Oransea and A place names, just because there are probably lots more of those, but not so many in the areas we were looking spatially. So, and I should say actually the maps there shows one of the Andorlan locations in West Loch Tarbert, where you can see there's sort of a spit of land where again the hydrodynamics has kind of influenced how the sediment is sort of established, and also is known as that kind of place name. To look into a little bit more, just taking that one. And looking over that wide area, so kind of survey area. The little pins, the orange pins, show where there's a place name, and then the black stars was where were able to also find mentions in the historical records, so those travel diaries, statistical accounts. So you can actually see there's quite nice alignment of those. And the challenge with those is they didn't cover such a wide spatial area. There would be like a travel route, basically. So the ship or the voyage would kind of visit various places. So it wasn't necessarily every single island or every single spot that you would expect, a thing to be found in. So really interesting match there. We also then later started to look for where modern oyster farming has been practiced around these locations. And again, I'll touch on that again later. Interestingly, the word Lynn, so the Gaelic element of that, is basically for sort of long and thin. So that's why you get these tidal isthmuses. Oops, sorry, I'll point out a couple places in a minute. And hopefully you can see here. So these are two Google Maps of two Dornland locations, where basically you can see it's this tidal causeway. So at high tide, the kind of sandy bit gets covered up, but at low tide, you can access the little rocky spit out there. And so again, this Lynn means it's a long, thin piece of connection. And it's interesting. So this one on the right is in Knoydart, which is a bit further on the mainland coast. And the one here on the left is from Mull. So that's one of the islands on the west coast. And I suspect the one on the left on Mull was taken at a much higher tidal site. So you can't actually see the little bank that connects the rocky bit with the mainland. I particularly like this one on the right. So this one, it doesn't really come up as the land feature being called a Dorlan, but actually if you look at this home name, they have basically taken that local place name and put it into, and I don't know whether that's like an Airbnb or whatever, but if you would go to that area and presumably ask people, if they knew or what they called that feature, it still is presumably in local memory through the Dorlan connection. So kind of a nice bonus from the Google screenshot. So I did a lot of after we sort of looked at the wider spatial area, we ended up looking a little bit on the Inner Hebrides. So those are the Isles of Mull and Islay. They're so not as far north as the Western Isles. They're kind of sort of just west of Oban and a bit further south from that. So this shows both the historical mentions, so where we were able to find accounts of oysters in one way or another, but also those habitat place names. So you can see there's lots of little patches where the oysters could have survived, or people had some connection to think that they would survive. The interesting bit about the red arrows is those were those two. Remember, I said there were only two places on the West Coast that actually had the word Aescherin in them. For about 3 years, that was the case. And then my colleague found one up in Lewis as well. So Skirna Aescherin, which was kind of great, did show that there was a little bit wider coverage. The yellow arrows actually show other place names, particularly in Islay. If you'll notice, there's a big clump of these, and that's because that coastal area has formed a number of sandbanks in kind of a loch, and that's true also up in South Uist, that there's sort of a number of sandbanks that are in the same kind of coastal area they get covered by high tide when it's in. Yeah. And I'll talk about the blue arrow that's on Jura in just a second. So in the kind of research around stories and songs, there are basically four recordings of this prophecy about Jura, and they reference this location in Tarbert that was the only place to get oysters on the island of Jura. And sort of there's this story that a woman was there gathering oysters, and the laird appeared and kicked over a basket. And as in a lot of Gaelic stories, there's a curse that basically she said he would leave Jura with one eye on a white horse with all his possessions. And actually, it did. There are accounts of the last laird of Jura who did have one eye. He didn't lose it for oysters or any other reasons. But he did end up leaving the island with all his possessions. I think taken by a white horse. There's a QR code here. If you want to listen to the story, it is in Gaelic, but there are a few mentions of it in the archive. I have a picture here that is basically supposed to be. It was one of the possessions that he left from the island with, and I think you can see the Papsajura in the background and the white horse. So that's sort of seen as, and you can see the original in Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow, which fits very nicely. And if you want to see what that area looks like today, this is kind of what it looks like on quite say an atmospheric day. I'm going to turn the sound off actually because it's very windy and very noisy. So this is the location where this prophecy was supposed to have happened. So you can see actually it's quite a narrow, a deep sea lock that goes into that part of the island. Oops. Um, so we also, in the course of looking at these cultural artifacts, and also there, in terms of the songs, there were very few mentions specifically of oysters. And now why that is definitely a discussion. Again, remember these are sort of oral traditions, so these are carried through people person to person. So they will experience changes in islands or in terms of interpretations of the artists. But there are quite a lot that do mention things about gathering mussels, gathering cockles, gathering limpets, and actually one. Avein Udach is actually a very, very well-known kind of lesson about a jealous sister who basically the two sisters go down to the shore to collect shellfish, and the jealous one ends up tying her sister's hair to the seaweed to kill her so she can marry the woman's husband. So light stuff, wonderful. There's some kind of grisly, grim messages that are in a lot of these songs, but that is one that's consistently is used in some of the kind of learning resources for Gaelic and Gaelic song. But it does show how much part collecting shellfish was a part of people's lives on a regular basis. And what I think is also very interesting, so this was the second mention in a story of oysters, so the actual word Aishirin. And this was the lady shown on in the photo on the right. So her name was Big Mari of the songs. She was very well known. Lived in Glasgow for a bit. Lived originally in Skye, was displaced to Glasgow, and then eventually moved back to Skye in her later life. But what she does mention is, she returns to this place where she frequently drank her fill at this well, and there were oyster shells at the bottom. So the English translation doesn't match the Gaelic here. It actually says scallop shells. But she also says today is so full of sediment, which is really interesting. That's one of the themes and one of the reasons for declines is very fine sediment ended up coming down watercourses and sort of suffocating the oysters. The fine sediment clogs up their filter feeding apparatus, and so it is actually a cause for beds to kind of fail on a large scale. This is a little bit, and I think, oh no, I didn't add the link in. So you can find recordings, sorry, recordings of the song. Sorry, 2 seconds. Okay, sorry, I was looking for my notes. Sorry, sorry. Oops. So this is story about the jealous sister. So that's sort of looking at things very, very okay, sorry about that. Um, so that's sort of looking at kind of the everyday way of life for people that were living in the west coast of Scotland, sort of through 1800s. So what we also did was we looked at some of the estate records for references to oysters and to see what people were, what the financial transactions were. So the oldest reference, and this is sort of listed in reverse chronological order, just based on the records at the Argyll State Archives, which are held at Inverary Castle, which is shown on the right there. Um, and so there were basically a lot of focus on creating oyster fisheries. The thing about the Argyll estates is basically they were landowners for a lot of times, Isla, Mull, and quite a number of other regions. So they did cover a large spatial area with the records for in one place. So there was interest in basically after the clearances and about the 1830s and 40s when there was periods of extreme poverty and very, very limited sources of food. There was a potato famine in like the 1830s, 40s, where there was repeated failure of the crops people depended on. So there was interest in oyster farming at that point about various sites that would be good for it. But actually, there were oysters that were essentially grown in a saltwater pond back in the 1750s. So from the castle records, it said this pond was quite productive for probably at least 30 years. And then during sort of improvements to the castle grounds, they changed the course of one of the rivers, and that seemed to basically cause that saltwater pond to silt up and basically um, eliminated the oysters. We did find specific mentions of when that pond was stocked. So basically, they built the pond and then they brought in oysters to put in. We didn't have in the records, it didn't mention exactly where they came from, but just that they were the numbers put into that pond. Um, yeah, and it failed around the 1750s. Um, we also were able to find, and there's definitely more you could look into here, mentions in 1742, 1750, kitchen inventories, which you don't think about it, but actually, the list of things purchased for the estate kitchen, they kept track of that. And there were mentions of specific items like oyster knives and pans and kitchen inventory. And the oldest mention, which was we just happened to be looking through the records when the archivist happened to be looking some other records about an inheritance that included a metal frame specifically mentioned for farming oysters. So it's really interesting when sort of there was a more recent interest. And, if you look across Europe, it says a lot of the oyster farming, sort of the cultivation, started in the 17th century. So this kind of, shows also evidence of that. But it also does show, the sort of where it fit in terms of who was eating oysters, that it was landowners, not just a food for the poor. Because the first thing most people say is, "Yep, shellfish were a food for the poor." But actually, we do have evidence that landowner were consuming them. Actually, the probably most significant one. Um, Another really interesting dimension to these records was the sorry, I lost my train of thought. Um, um, Mentions of actually they didn't pay for the oysters themselves, but the estate records were about paying for the labor to bring them and transport them. So we actually found records mentions of ones brought from Loch Broom over to Argyll to the Inverary Castle, presumably for some kind of event that they were having, and records of paying a tenant and his horse for accommodation. So one of the best sort of historical areas, and what is a really nice example of when effective management makes a difference. So one of the place names, so hopefully maybe you saw back in the place names example, the scar was actually one of the elements that did seem to indicate good oyster habitat. And there was one of these in Loch Ryan, so you can see there's this kind of little spit that comes out into the middle of Loch Ryan. Loch Ryan is the only wild native oyster fishery in Scotland for sure. And there's currently about 22 million oysters there. So they are able to harvest and sell commercially from wild stocks. So most of the oysters or all of the oysters you buy from other places are from farms. So they could be native, they could be Pacific species, but they are cultivated basically. They're grown specifically for sale, whereas the ones from Loch Ryan are actually from wild beds. Which is a big difference. But they basically in 1701 there was a royal charter granted to the landowner for Loch Ryan, and that bed has been managed specifically to produce oysters, and oysters of a very very superb quality, sent to Glasgow and otherwise. So this quote is from like the 1850s. But actually, that charter was given in 1701, and they actually have a really clear management rotational plan of where they harvest the oysters from the loch, and they don't also harvest them in the summer to kind of increase the chances for settlement and getting the juvenile stage to grow. So it's a good example of good management and how sort of doing that early on can sort of make a difference today. They also have a fabulous oyster festival where you can go and do tours, get loads of oyster sampling and shucking contests and the whole thing. So if you're ever up in September, it's definitely a place to visit for the whole thing. So I just want to spend a few last minutes talking a little bit about kind of how this is filling in the human element, the cultural side to ecosystem services, which if you're sort of doing ecology work today, and it's the benefits people have gained from the environment. However, making sure that aligns with the cultural connections, there are a lot of different cultural backgrounds within countries and within communities. So by recognize that, I think that's a very important part of the management, and this connection of the benefits for people and nature. And actually, just to define that too, there to separate out the spatial area. So, the Highlands and Islands, Argyll, are basically the region, but then you also have this cultural community, which is the Gaeltacht, which is associated with traditionally Gaelic speaking parts of the country, and that has changed over time, and based on basically language declines. Which actually this project has been really helpful in demonstrating how important it is to maintain languages, to understand these historical aspects of the past. So what we're doing to try to recognize that is we're embedding some education work that brings together the language side, the history, so the cultural heritage, these songs about going to the shore to collect shellfish, which in a lot of parts of the country is probably not done anymore. alongside environmental monitoring, sort of then to work with communities to help them have tools to understand how the place that they love and care about is changing, whether mostly due to kind of wider scale, sea level rise, climate change, those big global changes. So the People's Films wrote and filmed their own documentaries about native oysters and their connection to their place. So this was done on Isla, where we had those historical tales. So the little kids, the primary 1 to 3 peoples did oyster tales. The 3 and 4s looked at farming, and then the primary 5s and 6s, discussed about going forward and reintroduction. So the teachers were really fascinated with this, and actually, it was interesting at the start. They all were, everybody knew what an oyster was, but nobody really, and you could go to the farm and eat them, but they kind of didn't realize how much there was to study. So by bringing these aspects together, there was a really fascinating, like, well, nicely engaged exercise, and actually encouraged the Gaelic teachers to kind of look into science terminology, which was kind of a really beneficial aspect as well going forward. So we're also doing some environmental monitoring around these place names. There are potentials for false positives with place names, or places that, it was given that name for one reason, but actually, you've interpreted it maybe incorrectly. So we are looking into the habitat, because obviously if there were oysters there at one point, presumably could be a good place for them to grow. So we're doing that with looking at the water movements using the mini buoys. So those are shown on the left side. And my colleague Alejandra has been involved with testing and using those in a number of habitats. And we've also been doing soundscape ecology. So that's my research background in terms of monitoring environmental health through the collection of natural sounds. We also have sort of tried to integrate going forward the attention, the kind of current interest in restoration work. So we actually have a new Gaelic song celebrating the oyster, Oran na Éisirin, which is a song of the oysters that kind of goes through, shares about the restoration work. And we did a launch at the National Mada back in October. And next week, we actually are working with the Isla Gaelic Centre to integrate that into their, they have a movie room, basically a film room for it. So we're working with 2 of the oyster restoration projects to apply what we're understanding about the sediment and the habitats from these place names to their current work. So can they understand where to release their oysters better in their local area? And we're also sort of coming up with ways to kind of pull this together with, helping, working with communities to recognize this past relationship with shellfish, and how they can maybe use it for a sustainable industry going forward. So looking at sort of better ways to grow oysters and yeah. Oops. Okay, so I just wanted to leave you with basically a blessing that's just lovely. So the manager at the Isla Gaelic Centre gave this to us. I'll do my best. Bianaki a chaun is gach clown van lan, sagumbiar lavin salvacha. So it means a blessing on the sea and on every stone beneath the tide. May the shells be full and may our hands be safe, which I think if you're working at sea, quite a nice, full shells and safe hands. So okay, just a quick thank you. Thank you so much to Philip and John for inviting me, and all the collaborators. It's been a range, quite a lot of people who have participated in various areas, and a lot of the kind of partners who are working on going forward. So we have a mailing list that you can access via the QR code, or just email me too. And yes, stay tuned. The song is absolutely lovely, I have to say. Some amazing singers, some award-winning singers have recorded it. So we're really looking forward to releasing that shortly.
Okay, thank you very much, Shana. Could you're open for a couple of questions, I should think.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Could you say something about the modern industry, modern? You say Loch Ryan's the only place that's got native oysters, right? But so all the other places are American ones or whatever. But
So that's um, it is the only place that harvests them from the seabed.
okay,
They have big enough populations to be able to do that, to replace it, and they do it in a very rotational way. So they'll leave places to recover, and so I haven't said much about the life cycle, but it takes native oysters about 5 years to reproduce to reach reproductive age. So you basically have 5 years to
yeah,
wait till they get big enough to contribute back to make the population self-sustaining. So the modern cultivation kind of approach is the earliest stage is actually grown on land in a hatchery.
ah,
So then the growers buy very, very small oysters from a hatchery. They put them in the water and then they grow out, and they get fatter. They build
right,
up, grow in
yeah,
size in the sea. Yeah.
okay. And this is millions and millions of pounds industry, is it, or is it a
I was gonna say,
what is it?
it is actually so if you talk to the Shellfish Association, it is a very underused industry in
Yeah,
Scotland.
yeah.
Basically because there's not the local demand for that type of food.
Okay,
Most of the oysters actually get shipped, and mussels too get shipped overseas to where there is a demand. Um, yeah, sorry,
yeah,
did
interesting. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, John's waving his hand. Yeah, John, you go first, then Angela.
Couple of fisheries that have declined through sediment accumulation, and whether we looked at why. I wondered whether it was perhaps a period of excessively high rainfall. I mean, it's always raining in the west of Scotland, but even more so, and whether you can actually link meteorology to the decline of the oyster fishery.
Yeah, and actually, I've been talking with some colleagues about that because I feel like that's a really important next question, aspect to address. I think, and this is when now we're trying to connect catchment scale effects. I think, and I would really like to again look at the historical records for when land management's changed. So in that kind of period in the early 1800s, there was a big push to make more money out of estates, basically. So there was changes to tree cover, there was changes to peat bogs, and changes to salt marshes, which I think did affect the movement of the fine particles down. So I think that's a really, really interesting next step, whether you can disentangle that kind of, and pull in the meteorological records too. Because actually that was one of the reasons that there were, poor potato harvests, because they had a really, really set of wet years in the summer. Yeah. So yeah, great.
Yeah. Okay, Angela.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether any of the bigger houses had um, things like recipe books or things to do with the kitchen where people wrote down what they did. Did people used to eat oysters like we eat them?
Yeah, that's
That's right.
yeah, definitely. And I feel like that's certainly, I mean, the kitchen inventories, the implements to eat oysters, I think really does suggest that there probably was stuff related to it, and it's tracking it. And actually those records were found is basically the person in the estate who's in charge of, yeah, managing the household's things, yeah. And so recipe books would be, I have found recipes, a range of recipes. They're a bit more modern. So it's usually like 1900s, for yeah, oysters. And yeah, as I said, the food, that's a whole nother discussion, which yeah, is really exciting. And yeah, I get a bit carried away looking at oyster recipes sometimes.
You have to try them all out.
Yes. Well, actually, do you know one really interesting thing is, um, And I think in Europe they do feed um, invertebrates for, that are cultivated for human consumption, different things. So if you feed oysters different types of plankton, you will get different tastes. And that when you think about the natural environment, there are different plankton communities in the ocean. And so these oysters are eating different things. And so that's, again, another whole stream you could go into. But yes, oysters from different farms do definitely taste different.
Okay.
Okay, Philip has raised his hand there.
Yeah, Anna, thank you very much for a fascinating talk, and I love the the kind of update in the particular the vocabulary, which is a bit of a thing I'm very interested in personally. But I was wondering what you can tell us about the division of labor in oyster gathering and distribution.
That's a really good point. And actually, there's not to dodge the question. Mussels in particular were very much a female labor, and what their job would be to do would be kids would often gather them. Women would bait the hooks, and then the men would take the fish hooks out to sea. There's a really nice chapter in that Environmental Histories of the Fourth book that describes that, and actually how marriages were were settled on how well women could bait the hooks, because it made a big difference when they were trying to shoot the lines off boats. About how you put the ground up mussels onto the line. So I didn't say much about this, but actually there was a huge industry, again, one that crashed in the early 1800s related to kelping, so the extraction of seaweeds. And it seemed like, communities would go to the shore, both men and women, but they would they would camp on the shore to collect this kelp or to collect the seaweeds, and then rely on shellfish. So there was a big period too where presumably a lot of the shellfish were kind of taken to support these workers that were there for the kelp industry. So I think it was a particular women's responsibility to get shellfish from the shore.
So the men would be at sea and the women on the land, essentially, something of that order.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interestingly, actually, this is another, again, dimension, and a sort of boat use within island communities in the future was different. One of the things that I've read a number of places about Mull, and in particular, and Isla too, they didn't have a culture of boat building. It wasn't a thing, a skill that they had. And actually, when, again, there was sort of want to expand industries, they actually had to bring in people from the Western Isles and Orkney who knew how to build boats and knew how to, small boats, we're not talking like, but just, there was enough land agriculture, there was enough forests, the islands were big enough that they didn't need to access other islands to get resources. And I think that, and it was very dangerous. Some of the Corrie Vrecken is one of the big, interesting tidal regimes you get. So it was quite a dangerous thing to spend a lot of time, transiting by boat. So,
Thank you very much, Anna, for that.
Okay. Keith, you got your finger up?
Yeah. If you look at have you looked at archaeological finds? I mean, oyster shells, of course, stay forever. There will be heaps of oyster shells near villages over millennia, possibly. Have you included that?
So I have looked into that. Again, that's sort of a more recent thing that filling in this picture. So I've been kind of working from kind of, I don't say modern time back, and absolutely. However, again, do seem to be regional differences behind that. And actually, there was a study done comparing middens on Mull, so a cave on Mull, or on Alva, which is a little island right next to Mull, and comparing them to, I think it was Orkney. And they actually did comment, and they were looking at different mollusk species. So which types of shell were found in these middens. And actually they noted that Mull had very few oyster shells. It was mostly limpets, whereas and that was actually in contrast to most other middens that they knew of archaeologically. So, and certainly in the Forth, there are massive middens that are very, very full of oyster shells. The one caveat to that is, and the story that comments on using them for wells. So it is highly likely the shells could have been used for house building for products, or transported to other parts of the country. So they were collected, they were taken out on Mull or Isla, but then actually eaten in, Argyll or somewhere on the West Coast or further afield. I have read things about the Romans taking a lot of oyster shells, distributing in various places. So, I mean, that's another really interesting bit of analysis to look at, say, stable isotopes or something, where you can, find origins, try to connect up, present where it was dug up with where the animal actually lived. So, yeah, another whole area, but surprisingly few in kind of the target Inner Hebrides that we're looking at.
If you allow me another question, what species are we talking about? I'm from the Netherlands, and the flat oyster, Ostrea edulis, has been replaced by the Portuguese oyster. But maybe you're too far north for so far to have this change.
So far, cold water still is a thing, although, yeah. So it's mostly Ostrea edulis. The farm species now is Chrysostrea gigas, so the Pacific species. So far, there's not been issues of competition. However, we have been having, rising sea temperatures for periods.
Yeah.
Right now, it's actually a good thing because the oysters spawn for longer.
I prefer the flat oyster.
I haven't.
The taste.
Yeah. I haven't tasted a flat oyster yet. There have been a few times where I've just missed it, and that is generally what I've read. Actually, back to Angela's question, I happened to be in a B&B on Mull, and they had a bunch of cookbooks. One of them, it was Rick Stein's Shellfish Cookbook, and yeah, there was a whole bit on oyster recipes and taste tests, and yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, have you looked at sort of researched into the what Glasgow or the other big Scottish cities were eating in the 18th century and so on? Because Liverpool newspapers had adverts for oysters, and it was a staple food for the poor, really.
Yeah, and actually there are mentions of London, that workers would get tired of being fed salmon and oysters just because they were. I would think that there are, the movement, and because they were quite transportable, like they would stay alive for 10 days.
Wow.
They're okay, like that they'll, be fine. So actually they were a pretty, for the time, like transportable food source. So it is very possible that, yeah, these were taken to. I haven't found anything for Glasgow in particular, but certainly London. I think that was and Edinburgh too. Actually, I think I have read some of the kind of street sellers accounts of
Okay. Right. Well, I'll say thank you to Anna for tonight's talk, and I'll just mention that after Christmas, the next one is on the 21st of January, when Tom Rippeth from Bangor will talk about ocean microstructure development. So thanks, Anna. I'm going to press the stop recording now. Oh, here we go.